To show UV unwrapping of low poly models in a nice, well-rounded and hopefully concise way, I set up this scene that contains 3 different examples that we're going to walk through, each getting a little more, I guess, more complex and also different as we go along. We're going to start off with the cylinder here, which I think will make a nice example of kind of the basics of what UV unwrapping is actually doing, and when you unwrap something, how that's actually looking and behaving. Just to give you an idea, I remember when I first started, I couldn't really wrap my head around the actual process, like what it was actually doing, because it's kind of like a click of a button and the computer does it. But there's definitely a lot of manual sort of input that's required, and to understand it on a fundamental level is important to go through it. So that's what the cylinder will be for. Next up, we'll go over how I would approach unwrapping a character model. And this is actually mostly going to have to do with all the same stuff that we looked at with the cylinder example. Because if you think about it, a character model is really just a series of connected tubes. And so we'll unwrap it in a very similar way we did with the cylinder example. And to really make this nice and well-rounded, I thought we'd also take a look at an inorganic mesh, an inorganic example, because the way I unwrap, or the way one would unwrap a bridge, for example, is kind of a completely different thing. And so we're going to take a look at that as well, and hopefully give you just a nice little start on your unwrapping journey, and hopefully help you learn and get a good head start on unwrapping. Because yeah, it's a tricky one, but once you get it, you just get it. And I hope this can help out. So yeah, just like I said, we're going to start off with the cylinder. And if you're in a 3D program and you make a cylinder by default, it probably already has UVs. I want you to delete those though. We're going to start with a fresh UV canvas here. So there's not going to be any UVs attached to it at all. Basically, what you want to do is get a UV projection down. And most software allows you to kind of take a snapshot of the 3D viewport or one of the axes and project the UVs onto this 2D space here in the UV editor. Most 3D software lets you do this. I'm in Maya right now. From my experience with Blender has a similar thing, and whatever 3D software likely has a window like this for editing UV wireframes and stuff like that. So I don't want this to be a Maya specific tutorial, so I'm not going to explain the software side of things, like the how in the user interface. So hopefully you can maybe do a quick lookup on the wiki for whatever software you're using and find out how to do a projection. For this example, I want to start off with a Z projection. So I'm going to click my little handy button that projects on the Z axis. And what we get in the UV space here, in the UV window, is a 2-dimensional snapshot of the wireframe of our mesh, of the cylinder mesh. I went with this head-on Z-axis projection because it gives us a better starting point for unwrapping this particular model. But just to give you an idea of what's going on, I'll also do a Y projection just so you can see that if we're taking a snapshot from above, essentially, we get this pinwheel, which is the geometry from the top of the mesh. Even though you can't see it, the side geometry is still represented here in the UVs. It's just hidden because from the Y perspective on an orthographic projection, you can't actually see that face. And so that's why I did a Z projection, because most of the texture information, is going to be seen on the sides of this particular mesh. And we'll still unwrap the top and everything, but this is a good starting point. You'll see why in a second here. So basically, if you're unaware of what the UV space is, it is essentially just an area, a 2D area, U and V, those are the 2 axes, where we can put our UV information for this mesh and tell the mesh, the faces of the mesh, which parts of the texture to display. And so ideally, we can have this UV wireframe completely unraveled, unwrapped, opened up like a book almost, so that every face is seeing its share of the texture that's beneath it. I guess the best way to see this is to actually put a texture on this. So let me just add this checker texture here to the mesh. And now we can actually see on the mesh how our UVs are applying the texture to it. So like I said, the UVs for this top portion are in fact here. We just can't see them because of the orthographic nature of the projection we did. But they're there grabbing, it looks like just a single pixel from that top row there and displaying across the entire top of the cylinder this one line of pixel information. So I guess I could grab, let's just so you can see what's happening. I grabbed this UV in the center here, and I'm going to pull it up in the 2-dimensional space. So these faces are actually going to have a better look at what the texture is beneath it. So as I move that up, you should be able to see. Oh my gosh, just got more confusing. That's a little bit of a difficult example to unpack there. But basically, if you look at the UV space here, underneath is in fact just more checker texture. And so we're seeing that these faces here are getting a nice kind of clear look at the checker texture beneath it. And in the 3D space, we get a representation of that where these checkered squares are a little more clear, a little more square. That might have been a bad example to show because it gets a little wacky out there, but also kind of interesting at the same time. Let me look and see if there's a better example. I'm just trying to wing this here. So let's look at a different example that might be a little less confusing. Okay, basically, we did our Z projection, and from the orthographic Z perspective, I'd say that this polygon here got the clearest two-dimensional projection because it is just about flat on the Z axis. And so you can see the UVs are pretty much the same as the polygon, the same shape and ratio and everything. But as we get further and further away from that flat face there, as it starts to curve around the side here, we can see that it's starting to stretch the texture on the polygon face. And if we look at the same time over here in the UV editor, that is because apparently each of these faces is being represented by a smaller and smaller polygon. So it's getting less and less of that texture real estate, which isn't right. Ideally, those would be the same size as this guy here, as this face here. And so that's what unwrapping is going to achieve. It's going to basically take the polygons and pull them out to the correct size. So if I were just to do it by hand, I would just push it and pull it like this. And now we can see that even around this curve here, we're getting kind of an even checker texture. And that's looking okay. But we do have like a mirroring effect here. Because if you look back in the UV editor, these faces are overlapping right now. So we want to do like a true blue unwrap here. That's just to show you. I don't know. Hopefully I didn't confuse you even more. That was a bit confusing. But yeah, you'll see once we unwrap it, I think most of you probably have an understanding that we need to take this 3D object and make it 2D. Kind of like we're opening a cardboard box, you know? Okay, so beyond all that, that's kind of all theory and stuff like that. The actual way to unwrap this is to make some cuts in it, just like a cardboard box has cuts in it. Even though it was once a cube, there's some areas where it is allowed to fold open and spread apart on the edges of the box. For a cylinder, the best way to do that usually is just to select these tops here and just kind of isolate those and detach them from the body of the cylinder, just so that it's free to unwrap. So I'm going to select those. I'm going to cut them. We're not actually cutting the mesh itself. These are cuts made to the UV. So we're not actually detaching any geometry. There should be an option to cut the edges in your 3D software. So I'm going to cut those. And you can see that there's a cut edge there because of this bold line here now. And now that those are away, I can actually move this away from the top and bottom in the UV space. You can see that our tops and bottoms here are now detached. I'm just selecting them. I'm going to move them out of the way just for now, just so you can see that this is the top and bottom that we just selected in that Z projected orthographic view. So they just show up as lines, but you can still see along the line that there's these vertices here. So the geometry is still there. We'll get to that afterwards. I just want to do this part first because it's the biggest part. So now that we have this tube, we want to make an incision on it as well. I'm going to go around behind it actually and make a cut on the back face. You usually want to try to hide your cuts. For characters and stuff like this is just a cylinder, so just, I don't know, put it in the back there. And I'll make a cut there, and we'll see that bold line. And now, if you just imagine this as like a cardboard tube or something, it's going to open up from this edge here and unwrap. So I'm just going to go up and hit the unwrap button, and we'll see what happens there. And so the computer did its thing. It kind of made a mess. It just kind of slapped it in the middle there. It's had a sideways skew there, which is fine. I mean, you can go through and you can straighten this out and stuff. But yeah, essentially we have our tube unraveled, and now you can see that all these polygons, like we were talking about before, are seeing the same amount of real estate on the texture itself. So now we can go and we can arrange this on our texture however we like and do what we want with that. But that auto unwrap, just doing it by itself was kind of a mess. So I actually want to also show you, let's see if I can back up enough. So I actually want to back up a little bit and show you a different technique for doing this a little in a nicer way. Instead of letting the software unwrap it however it likes, we can actually give it a little more information to inform its unwrapping decisions. And one of those techniques is actually called pinning, I believe. I'm just going to call it pinning. And it's when you take the UVs and you actually deselect some of them so that when it does the unwrapping algorithm equation, whatever you want to call it, when it runs the unwrapping script, it isn't able to move some of the UVs. The UVs will stay right where they are in this UV space here. And the reason why you'd want to do that is because it does some different kinds of calculations relative to the deselected UVs that actually control where it sends all the other UVs when it's unwrapping. So I guess a good example, like if you can picture in your head a book. When you open a book, it pivots from the spine of the book. And so we know which direction each half of the book is going to go. It's going to go left and it's going to go right. Because from the spine, those pages or those sides of the book are actually pivoting from there. We can do a similar thing with the cylinder as well. We know where the opening of our book is going to take place. It's going to take place here on the back. So where do I want my spine to be? Where do I want the pivoting to be? I want it to be on the opposite side. So I'm going to deselect these UVs that are now selected and deselect them. And now the software will know, it'll do a different kind of calculation and send each half of our cylinder away from those pinned vertices, those pinned UVs. So I'm going to hit the same old unfold UVs button with my two pinned UVs and we'll see. Okay, so now you can see that the UVs that we pinned, these deselected ones here, they stayed exactly where they were. And then relative to where they were pinned, the system was able to make a better approximation of where it wanted to send or where we wanted to send the rest of the UVs. So this looks a lot nicer. If you take a look at the 3D mesh itself, you can see that it's pretty well and evenly unwrapped. The texture, the checker texture looks appropriate across the entire surface of the cylinder. So yeah, I think that's probably done as far as the body of the cylinder. And so yeah, you just take that and stick it on your texture wherever you like and do whatever you'd like with that. So just stick it there for now. So that just leaves these top portions here. These haven't been unwrapped yet. And this is just as simple as grabbing the faces and doing a Y projection because it's just a flat surface. So I just do my Y projection. We get our pinwheel here again, and you can just select both of those. I'm just going to leave them overlapped because usually, I don't know, like for a barrel or something, those are going to be the same top and bottom. If you want to, you can separate them. You can do whatever you want with your UVs and position them however you like on your texture sheet. But yeah, pretty much that's the very basics, the basic idea of what unwrapping is doing here. What also might be nice for you to experiment with is just changing the size of these, moving them around, scaling them up and down, and seeing how that affects the grid texture on the mesh itself. And I don't know, as you mess around with it, you'll get more used to just kind of the nature of unwrapping and what this is actually doing. For example, as I scale this up, we're actually squishing this texture. So yeah, it's one of those things that you get a feel for. I recommend just messing with it, experimenting, playing around with it, grabbing vertices and pulling them up and down, and just to see like what that actually does on the texture. Because you can do a whole lot of really interesting things just with UVs. I guess one example that comes to mind now that I'm doing this is, say I am making a barrel, but I want it to look a little more disheveled or something, but I have like a polygon budget, or I want to do like a low poly look. You can actually use the UVs and kind of like scramble them up a little bit, just take them and offset them a little bit here and there. And you can give kind of the impression of more detail that isn't actually there in 3D. But now, I don't know, if this was an actual wood texture or something, you kind of give it the impression that there's some weathering or some damage or something to this just by offsetting the UVs. And so that's always something you can mess around with. So I recommend just playing with that for a while. It's definitely something you're going to have to experiment with and get that experience in, because a lot of this stuff, it'll come naturally eventually, but that all comes with experience and playing around with it. Hopefully that gave you a good jumping off point for there. If you're feeling comfortable, why don't you join me on the next example? I don't know if we'll do all this. It's a whole character, but we will do, the important parts of unwrapping this character. I definitely want to get into the hands because that's a troublesome point. the feet, we might just unwrap half of it. Hopefully, after doing that cylinder, you can actually just look at this and see, oh yeah, I'm going to unwrap it, just like the cylinder, and on the legs and on the arms and maybe the torso. So hopefully that's at least giving you a better look at kind of a lens to view this next more complex character under. So we'll get started with that next. Just like with the cylinder, I'm going to start off with a Z projection just to populate the UV editor with the UVs themselves. And from here, I'm actually just going to go through and cut this guy up a little bit to make the little elements easier to understand and to manage. So pretty similar to the cylinder, honestly. I'm going to go around and make some incisions on the character where I know I want to isolate basically the little modules of the character. And I'm just going to do it on this one half for now. I'm actually just going to delete the other half and copy them afterwards. Let's just assume that this character's texture is going to be mirrored anyway. You might have a character that has unique elements on either side, and this will still work. It's still worth it to duplicate the UVs anyway, because then you can just fold them open in the UV editor and texture on both sides uniquely. But in a lot of cases with low poly games, you want to emulate that sort of restricted style where there is more of an effort to make the best use of the UV space. And in a lot of cases in those games, they would just have mirrored characters. Maybe not for the face. Maybe the face you want to have some unique elements, so that could be left unmirrored. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll go over that when I get there. But for now, I'm just going to chop this guy up. And I'm basically, if you think about it, just making cylinders. Just making a bunch of little tubes to deal with. And I'm going to try to keep these cuts kind of discreet. But these are the usual cut points that I do here. So I'll isolate the hand, I'll chop the arm off the shoulder, and I'll take the leg and the foot apart as well, and then I'll kind of just leave the torso where it is. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to make my opening incisions as well. So I'm going to make a cut right up here, up the back of the arm, all the way across. And the same for the leg. I actually might make this cut on the inside of the thigh and then like just down here to the ankle on the inside. And that just might be a better way to hide it. I guess that can be changed later as we are unwrapping. We can always cut things and rearrange them as we need. So for now, I think that's pretty good. I'm actually, while we're here, just going to make a cut right up the middle of the character so that I can isolate each side in the UVs. And you'll see how that kind of plays out as we go. Get in here into the face. There's a bunch of triangles. So I think that's pretty good for now. I'm going to do a cut. And we can see with the bold lines where our cuts have been made on the model. And hopefully, when I go in here and make my selections, the pieces are indeed isolated. So we have our arm here, our hand here. This whole half of the body, I'm going to push over here because we're not going to deal with that. The way I copy UVs over is I finish unwrapping this, and I'm going to delete the other model and copy it over. There's maybe a better way to do that. So maybe I don't know, you can look into it, but that's how I do it. I know the model is the same on either side, so I'm just going to copy the UVs that way later. And we have our torso. This actually has the head included, so I'm going to cut the head off as well. It's like we're hiding a body or something. We're just cutting it up into pieces. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I'm just going to make a cut here for now. The neck, we'll see what happens with the neck. I think that's going to be fine, though. Cut it, pull the head off just so it's easier to understand down here. And then, of course, we also have our leg and our foot all separated. Now, the torso, actually, we have this like crotch part here that didn't get a cut. So if we try to unpack that right now, I guess I can just show you what it looks like. It's going to be all funny. So it doesn't know what to do. It's trying to keep all the edges together, obviously, because we didn't make any cuts there. So this is like where the leg would go right here. And we could simply just cut that at the crotch there and let that open up so we don't get weird distortion on this part of the mesh. So I'm going to undo that. I will simply make a little cut here. And also, we don't want to forget, I'm going to add my pins. So you can do multiple pins. In a lot of cases, you can do multiple pins if the edge is kind of flat. This one's pretty straight up and down. But you can also get by with just doing one pin, and the system kind of just understands from there. If you want to get really dictative, though, you can go up all the way up and down the side here. I'm just going to grab, I guess, under the armpit and then down to the hip area. And that's essentially going to keep this space between these two pins even as I unwrap. And it should look a little nicer as I unwrap it. It's still like twisted it around for some reason. Maybe I have a setting wrong. Let me just look. No, that's just the way it works. So I'm going to unwrap it. That's fine. It still kept the spacing and everything the way I wanted it. It's just that when the unpacking happens, it kind of threw it into the UV space. I don't know why. Another good thing about having this grid texture here is you can see where the distortion is all taking place. Since we left this hole here where the arm goes, we see a lot of distortion here. There's not usually a whole lot you can do about that. There's other ways of cutting this open. We could make another cut on the side and then separate the back from the front. This gets the job done for me. I usually just do it this way. I'm going to leave it as is for now and see if maybe we can fix it after I'm done unwrapping, because we're not done yet. I want to make this a little nicer afterwards by moving around these vertices, because the unpack, it's not perfect, and we can actually make it better by hand. So yeah, I'm just going to keep going down the list here. We got this arm. I'm going to go opposite to my cut and put my pins, unwrap. Now we have a nice little unwrapped arm. And if you really want to see it, you can stretch it nice and big and get a good view of this checker pattern here. And so that's pretty nice. It doesn't have a lot of distortion. I think in most cases, these tubular type shapes do pretty well with the unwrapping process. It's kind of the simplest thing you can unwrap. So yeah, same thing. I'm going to make some pins, unwrap it same old way. So that's a leg. That's going to go kind of with the torso. The arm, just going to put off to the side. And I guess the head is the last really simple part of this unwrap. I'm leaving the hands and the feet because they're a little more complex. For this case, the head is so minimalistic that I'm just going to do a regular unwrap on it. So I'm going to pin it just there and click the unwrap. And that should be fine for that. I think with more features on the character, with a more complex model or something like that, you'd want to pay more attention to where things are being unwrapped, maybe add some cuts to alleviate the stretching. But this guy is just basically just a nose and an upper lip. Otherwise, it's pretty much featureless. So I think this is going to do for the tutorial anyway. So that's done. That was pretty quick. We're already almost done. Just got to do the hands now. So the hands and the feet I saved. It's really not that much more difficult, just a little bit more work and attention. So I usually like to do another projection here just to get a better starting point. Having a projection of the side of the hand is actually a little more difficult for the system to process during the unwrap. It can have a little bit more trouble. So giving it a better starting point is helpful. And that starting point would be the Y. So I'm going to do a Y projection. And now you can see we have a much more understandable laid out flat hand. So for unwrapping the hand, I generally just go around and cut off the bottom side of the hand, and then I'll weld them together over here on the back of the pinky, just so there's no seam there. So that we'll have a seam. There's kind of no way to avoid seams on the hand unless you're getting really high poly and you can generate your maps in a different way. But I'm imagining that you're using photo textures or you're painting this texture or something. And we're just going to have to deal with seams on the forefront. That's just kind of the nature of hands. So bear with me. I'm just going to go around and just basically cut off this half here. And I'm actually just going to cut the thumb out for now because I don't know what to do with it just yet. It's kind of weird in here. But I carry on through this whole edge all the way around and back up to the wrist. And to alleviate stretching on the fingers, I'll have like these little flaps here. These are going to kind of flip up, so there's not too much weird stretching in there. I don't know if that's super necessary, but because this hand is essentially a box, I think it's needed because there's really no way to kind of flatten out a box without giving it corners like that. And you'll see what I mean once we get back into the UV stuff. The thumb, I'm a little confused by the thumb. I don't know what I'm going to do with it right now. We'll just deal with it. I mean, it's going to have the same rule as the rest of the fingers, right? So maybe I'll just cut this like this. Yeah, I don't quite remember. Let's just leave it at that for now. It's going to be one of those things I figure out as we go because I can't remember. So I'm going to make my cuts there. And hopefully, if I did it right, I've separated these two sides of the hand as well as the thumb. So for the top of the hand, just like we've been doing, I'm going to pin it just so we don't get too much stretching on top, too much diversion. I'll unwrap it. And yeah, the hand is always going to be funny, especially if you have more than just a couple fingers. You have to come in and really organize these. I just have these like two finger style here. But if you have all 5 or even 4 fingers, it can get pretty noisy in here, and you got to really organize and pay close attention to make sure nothing's overlapping. I guess we'll get into a little bit of that because I don't want this to be splayed out like that. I want it to be straight up and down. And I want to unwrap this side as well. I don't think we need to pin it. I'm just going to do a straight unwrap because I'm going to have to mess with this anyway. But you can see now that we have these two halves separated, in the final, I'm going to fuse these back together here along this seam in the back so we don't actually see a seam there. Because we want to keep the seams to a minimum. And it's really the best we can do for that. Now the thumb, I don't really know what I did. I'm just going to unwrap it and see. Oh, it actually doesn't look too bad. So I managed to make a nice little tube out of it, I guess. It's going to be fused back to the hand as well. I essentially just did this in pieces. If you want to think of it as like a smaller character is the hand, kind of like we've been chopping apart the arms and the legs of the full character. The fingers and thumb of the hand are like the limbs of that smaller character. I split it up just to make it a little more easier on myself to understand. Yeah, we'll get back to that afterwards when we're reorganizing everything and welding things back together. But that's pretty good for now. And if you want to check, you can see what the checker texture is looking like on this hand. And now lastly, the foot. This guy doesn't have any toes. He's essentially wearing boots, and that means it's going to be a little simpler. So generally, I guess what I do is I cut off the sole of the foot altogether. So I'm going to cut that off, separate that. Oh, I actually made a cut over here. That's not a bad place for a cut though, honestly. So I made a little cut on the back of the heel. It might actually do well to line up the incision with the cut on the leg so that when we reattach it, the polygons line up. If your program must have an option to weld edges together. So if you just select the edge that you cut by accident, you can go in and sew. In Maya, it's called sewing the UV edges. You can sew the UV edges back, and so they're just no longer cut. So I'm actually going to make my cut along this edge here. And what that'll do is basically have this whole top of the foot unwrapping, and then this whole behind the heel area will come out off to the sides as well. So I'm going to cut that, and we'll see how that worked. It might have been nice to do a Y projection for this as well. Let's just see how it does, just for curiosity's sake. Like we have a Z projection on this, leaving it with just like a line of vertices here. And normally I would do a Y projection, but let's just see. Maybe it'll still do. Yeah, it handles it okay. I think when it's more complicated, maybe it can get tangled up during the unwrapping process, but that was fine. On something simple like this, it works out okay. And so this side, I'm not going to pin this at all because the spacing between these vertices isn't what I want. I want it to be more like, if anything, like a Y projection. So I guess it would have been smart to Y project anyway. But since we found out that it works okay to unwrap it anyway, for something so simple, we're going to do that. So that's the foot unwrapped. And I guess we could like weld this back together over here. Is this where this connects? Let's see. No, this connects over here somewhere. So maybe we won't get to weld this together. I guess if anything, it goes over here. Maybe what I would try to do is just attach it on this side here. Is this the outside edge? Yeah, just fix the outside edge at least. Because, okay, I'll weld it and we'll see like what happens to the UVs. So I'll weld this to the edge because we want to remove that seam. I won't go all the way out here to the toe because this is where a lot of stretching is going to happen. So I'm just going to weld this inner edge here, or it's the outer edge in the mesh. So I'm going to do sew UVs and they'll plop together. And then now if I go to smooth it, I think we run into a weird distortion here where now this boot is going off to the side. With low poly textures and stuff, since we're dealing with so few pixels, I like to keep the UVs straight up and down or straight on a grid, sideways on a grid. And so when you have a texture like this skewing off to the side, you tend to get like weird distortion with the pixels at that point. I know it's like if you have a high resolution texture, you don't have to worry about this sort of thing. But I'll show you quickly. I'm not going to do a full complete thing here, but I'll at least do the UV unwrap. Like I'm not going to do texturing and stuff. But I'll show you that I'll go in and I'll organize all the UVs for the entire mesh to be straight up and down. Pretty much. I don't know. I don't know if it's worth to do everything. It's a little tedious, but I'll show you the basic idea of it. And with that in mind, I'm going to undo this attachment here. I'm going to grab this part that wrapped around the heel here. I'm actually going to switch it over to the other side. So I'm going to cut the edge here, grab this part, just basically invert it. It's going to stick right back over here instead. Sew that back together. And then that gives me more freedom to just attach this and not have it skewing off to the side or not needing to skew it off to the side. So sew UV edges. It was skewing off to the side because it needed to find a place for this portion to go. And I'm going to tell this to go straight off to the side when we're reorganizing the UVs. And then I'm going to tell this stuff to go straight up and down. That's good for now. We never actually combined the hand. I guess we can do that now. Let's just go through and you can select all these edges. Sew UV edges and then those combine to each other. This is a bit confusing in here because the thumb, it's going to connect. I guess we want to connect it to this side. This thumb contains the top and bottom of the thumb, but we've unwrapped it so that the bottom is on one side and the top is on the other side. So it's not going to match up perfectly. So I'm at least going to connect this portion here just so the top of the thumb doesn't have a seam, right? This part here. So select that, and we're going to remove that seam by sewing it together and then smooth it out. And now we get a nice smooth transition between those two things there, those two elements that were separated before. And since we're doing all of that, why don't we just go back to the body we've been neglecting and actually sew that together. I guess it's just the legs we're going to sew. Let's see how we can connect this. I think this all connects. Yeah. So I'll just select this and I'll sew it together. And then I'm going to kind of do a little smooth here. And the arm, I think the arm is already done. I guess we can attach the hand to the arm. That might be a nice thing to do. So I'll flip the hand over. Let's see. I want to get basically the top to be hidden. So let's see what, okay, so that's these. Oh, actually, since the seams are offset, it's going to end up being something like this. But let's select them through the 3D port just to make sure we're getting the most obvious ones. Yeah, so that's pretty good. I'll sew that. That gets rid of the seam. And just for the sake of it, I'll do a little unfold to smooth things out. If you're not using Maya, I don't know what the unfold is for you. I'm sure there's an unfold or at least some way to average out the UVs. And yeah, so okay, so the foot, remember we have this whole ankle thing shooting off to the side, and that's actually just part of the leg. Let's see where that lines up. We might want to move this around a little bit. Yeah, so now because of that thing we did, the edge is over here, and I don't know if I like that. So yeah, I think I'm actually going to go back on what I just did. we're gonna go back to the way it was. I don't want to add this sole part of the boot anymore. So sorry about that. We're going to cut that part off again. But that's part of it. You got to feel it out. It's not all going to happen automatically. I'm going to cut this back off here where it was cut before. Just bear with me. This is all, you know. Okay, so now this, okay, so I'm seeing as I select this, it's selecting this as well, selecting both of these. So I know that my foot is going to start here and then connect as we go across this other direction. And yeah, I remember being really afraid of this sort of thing when I was learning, but you can take those UVs and just move them around. Don't worry about like how the system automatically unwrapped them. You'll see in a second what I do later to better organize this. We basically take every vertice and move it away from where it was before just to nicely pack this in. So don't be afraid if something doesn't quite fit. Like it's not the end of the world if you want to take some UVs and scooch them around to just be better organized for your purposes. Like this is going to be over here. This looks better to me. And then I'm going to sew this whole thing to the leg. And the sole, I'm not sure has, I guess I can connect it on the inside now. I'm just going to keep that separate for now. There's probably a way you can squeeze it in there and get it to fit nicely and everything. With all the elements basically unwrapped, the next step that I want to do is kind of a tedious step, but pretty necessary if we're dealing with low poly models and low resolution textures. And that is to go through each of these UV maps and square off all the edges. So for example, on the face here, we're going to be mirroring over this UV when we duplicate the model. You'll see afterwards. I'm going to delete this model, duplicate it just to copy the UVs so I don't have to remake them. But this is going to be the point where our texture starts to mirror right across this edge. So we don't want this kind of organically curved shape here. We actually want this to be straight up and down so that when our texture comes in here, it doesn't have to conform to this shape. It can just be a square. So it helps for doing this kind of mirroring technique, and squaring everything up also helps with just packing these things in a more optimized way, because we have these fingers all flailing out in different directions. We have this kind of tapering off to the foot here. And so when we have this totally squared off, it's going to make better use of the texture. I think with higher resolution textures and with higher detail models and stuff like that, this isn't a necessary step. But when we're talking about really low resolution textures to the point where we're seeing pixels and stuff, we want to make sure that everything lines up to conform to the pixel grid essentially. I guess to illustrate that, I'll take this head and I'll scale it up so we can pretend that this grid is actually the pixel grid of a texture. So right now we have it kind of in an organic fashion conforming to this line here that we have on the center of the mesh. but we see the pixels, they kind of come down and they skew and they stretch and they tilt in weird ways. So that this mirror converging point is going to show non-square pixels in kind of like a weird curve with the pixel grid here. We don't want to see these kind of half pixels here. We want this all to be straight up and down across the face so that you essentially won't even see the seam. It's just going to look like it goes straight across on the pixel grid. I guess it's better just to show, but that's the idea, is we're going to go through all these edges, especially these mirror edges, these center edges, and make sure that those are conforming to a pixel grid. So yeah, let me just show you how I would go about doing that. So I would just select all the edges and flatten them out just like that. All the edges that can be flattened out, I'm just going to bring them out to the sides like that. And that way on the mirroring edge, we'll get a straight up and down line of pixels just like we want. And I might even take the neck here because that's essentially a straight line there, and flatten that out. And that way I can flatten the neck up here out and maybe even connect that at some point, or at least keep this edge consistent with the rest of the body or the rest of the neck. So just kind of get that how you think it should look, nice and organized and tidy. And then what I usually do to keep things from looking too distorted after that is select all the interior UV vertices and unfold those or smooth them or unpack them however you'd like to. And that way it averages across the new shape. So it's not good. It doesn't need to be aligned perfectly on the inside, but at least the edges are lined up. So it's easy to pack this, and we have our mirroring edges ending up on a perfect line. So when we add a texture in, it mirrors and it looks a lot nicer. I think if you really wanted to go crazy, you could get these to be pretty angular. Like I feel like I could take the face even, and I could get away with doing that. Maybe this middle line here where the jaw is, I can straighten that out too. And also when you're painting your texture at the end of everything, you can move these around to better suit what the texture is doing on the model. Because if you look at the model while you're distorting these things, you can kind of see how it's behaving. So for example, if your eye doesn't line up or something, you move that down. Or if you want to give it kind of a different expression, you can move that to be more in line with the actual geometry. So that's a quick and dirty job there for that, but I think that's fine. The idea is just to get those edges to be consistent with the pixel grid. And so another example is the arm here. We can actually take all of these up and down vertices, these edges here, and bring those out as well. On the arm, I also want to do these horizontal lines here because those all have to connect as you wrap around the arm. Let's look at it in 3D. This edge here has to align with this other one here too. So right now you can see on the grid, like that square is up here on this half and down here it's lower. So if I take all those and actually straighten them out, you'll see that those pixels, I'm using air quotes, will line up with each other. So now we have a nice consistent line right there across this seam here. And the more we straighten out all of these edges, the more consistent that pixel line is going to be. So I'm going to do as many as I can, keep it nice and consistent, make sure that each of these lines up, each edge lines up with itself. So this one here goes all the way across. So I'm going to line them up. And now that we've been moving stuff around the hand, got a little goofy here. We got some overlapping stuff. So we're just going to pull that down. It is a bit of a trick to turn an organic shape into a very inorganic shape. But once you start texturing, it really does help to have all this stuff in a more manageable way here. And the hand is a whole complex character in its own, so it does take a little while. I said it was tedious. Take a while to go through here and get everything to line up nicely. The general idea is, I don't know, the thumb is probably going to go horizontally and all the fingers should go vertically. So I'm just going to quickly grab all these. I don't want to spend too much time. I don't think there's a lot of value, but I do recommend you on your own model spend the time and get this stuff looking pretty neat and tidy. Because once you go to texture, it really does help and it saves a lot of time. So I'm just going to quickly go through and straighten these out like this. So the finger is a nice little visualization of how far I can push these vertices without too much fear, because it was quite an organic shape and now it's basically an opened up box. So if I take a look at it, let's enlarge it as well just to see what that looks like on the texture. So you'll find that as you organize these edge loops this way in the UV space, the texture kind of conforms nicer to the shape of the mesh. So like it's flat and inorganic in the UVs, but because of that, it's projecting the texture on each of these polygons in kind of a one-to-one way with how the actual mesh is constructed. So you'll see this line here at the middle of the finger, it kind of goes in the same sort of sentiment as the actual mesh goes. So it curves down here with the knuckle and follows through. And so that's a nice little way, that's a nice little benefit of actually organizing it this way. Whereas when it's organic, it does its best to create a perfect grid across the entire surface, which is helpful for certain use cases. But when we're talking about these low resolution textures, you really want to have everything aligned to that pixel grid. So I guess I'll do the thumb here. I don't know how far I'm going to push this. I think you probably get the idea. You're just making all these edge loops and all these edges and everything square up, just like this. And don't be afraid of messing up the auto unwrap. We just unwrapped it just to get everything flat. And now that it's flat for us, we can do whatever the heck we want with these. So yeah, spend some time getting all this looking nice and straight. So I don't know if I'm going to go too much further with that. That's something where you just put on some music and you go through and try to relax while you're doing it. But I said it was tedious, and it is. But you'll see it makes for nicer, low resolution, low fidelity texture in the end. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at there. I would obviously go through and just make all this stuff as straight as I could. I will show you how I would do this part here, just because maybe that's a little bit different for you. But it is really just the same thing. I'm going to take all these edges and pull them right out so that they align to the grid. And as I do that, I'm obviously getting a much thicker UV at the ankle. It's going to be the same thickness at the ankle as it is on the thigh, which it doesn't technically make sense, but when you have a pixel line going down the leg, you want it to be consistent with the geometry. If you don't have a hotkey like I do to just send your selection into a straight line, like I've been doing this whole time, probably driving you crazy. That's just a custom script thing that I have. Maybe your software does that, but if you don't have that, you can take the line and just scale it on that axis to bring all those UVs into alignment. So that's as much as you really need to do. You don't have to have like a special, that's just a time saver that I happen to have in my workspace. But look into it. Maybe on the wiki, you'll find something similar that you can use. So yeah, just like I've done the vertical, I'm going to go through and do the horizontal as well. Just bring those right up. And make sure the edge loops, like this knee here is one edge loop, right? It goes all the way around. So I want both ends of the edge loop to line up. And I want that to be consistent. And now the foot, I can tell, is out of scale with everything now, but I'm going to try my best to get that to conform as well. And the foot actually can be, let's just make it a square. This area here is a bit rounded, and I want to leave it that way. I don't think it really does a whole lot for us to flatten that out too much, but just to make sure that it's averaging out properly, I'm going to grab all that and just unpack just that little section. And then we should get like a better understanding of what that scaling and everything should be, because the computer is doing all the calculations and stuff. So it kind of popped it out a little bit. It enlarged it. And now that I'm looking at it, this line here can just as well be flat. And you'll see, I think a lot of this stuff becomes more obvious that it's useful when you're actually doing the painting of the texture, or, just creation of the texture, because you'll find that instead of having to like draw around like a weird curve, if you need to put, I don't know, just say you want to put a line on the character's shirt or something up and down the character's shirt, you don't have to draw a squiggle. You can just draw a perfect line. So like on the pants, if you want to have like a stripe on the side of his pants or something, you can just draw a perfectly straight line, and you don't have to worry about any kind of like pixelation or jaggy edges because you're working in such a low resolution. And now you can just have that perfectly straight line still conforming to the curvature of the character's model, but you don't have to worry about drawing any curves yourself. It's just a perfect line. It keeps everything nice and consistent. And I'm sure you'll see the benefit of it when you actually start doing it. And also, like, don't just take my word for it. Look at other low resolution textures for actual video games. A lot of those things surface online because of modding and stuff like that. So you can see that they do lay out their UVs in this kind of rigid way. They obviously spend more time than I'm doing now, and you should also spend more time than I'm doing now on making it look nice. But you'll see that most of the characters and stuff and the environmental assets, they're all aligned to that pixel grid, because they know that it's easier to draw a straight line with a low resolution texture than it is to draw a curve, because you're going to have all that weird aliasing and stuff. So I decided I was just going to go through and do the whole thing because I guess I remember things as I go, and maybe those are things that are nice for you to hear about. So, and one of those things is when you have holes like this in your UV shell here, this is the part where the arm would be. So this is kind of the shoulder where the arm comes out from. It's a little tough to work these into a grid. But what I usually do, kind of similar to what I did with the face, is I created the grid as I wanted it around there. And then you can just select all the vertices within that and unwrap that. And that'll kind of unpack it as best it can to conform to, you know, the surrounding vertices and just kind of make it a little more organized for you. And also, if you have like a relaxation unfolding tool or whatever, like that might be nice to mess with too. That kind of just relaxes the edges and the vertices within that square. But yeah, a lot of times you'll end up with stuff that looks like this, and it's kind of hard to grab each piece and move it by hand. So a quick trick is just to grab that stuff once you're done doing the border and stretch it out across that stuff with the unwrap tool. And then from there, you can go back to distorting everything and making everything align properly. So I'm gonna, you know, I want this middle line here to go all the way down through. And then these are kind of free nomads that you can just put them whatever looks nicest to you. I don't really know what's going on with this geometry over here in the armpit. It's kind of a weird convergence there of things. So there's no real way to organize it perfectly. Do it until you're happy with it. So we're starting to get, you know, everything squared up nicely. And then maybe I'll adjust some of the spacing here. Like this looks a little close to me here. So I might just take this whole line, push it over. And yeah, you can just kind of figure it out as you go. I realize I'm doing this tutorial for you, and I don't want to leave you with some files that are incomplete and stuff. I'll leave files that are ones before we started and ones after, just so you can examine it for yourself and see, you know, how things were done and maybe learn from that in that way. So yeah, I'll go through and I'll do everything, and that way you can have a nice point of comparison. Okay, so I think that's pretty reasonable there for the UV layout. You will have this file as well, so you can probably scrutinize it. There's probably some things I didn't get quite right, but I'm pretty satisfied with that for now. I think you get the idea. You know, make everything a square so the textures are easier to apply and everything just looks nicer on the pixel grid. So I've even gone through and I made the face pretty angular here, and you can see how it's really conforming to the geometry there. The eyebrow actually comes out and goes back in, and since our UV edges here are just straight up and down, the grid underneath actually follows along with that. So that might help you with texturing as well. So now that that's finished, I'm going to take these. This is kind of a hacky way to do this. I'm going to take these and just scale them way up just so I can see like what the scale and stuff looks like. I might not be able to fix all these issues. Like we're getting pretty enlarged here in the chest and this arm is stretched out, like stuff like that I'll fix. But sizing it up on the grid there gives me a chance to see how everything is looking on the grid and if there's anything that needs to be fixed as far as scale is concerned. So for example, this forearm here, I can see that all this stuff is very stretched out on this polygon and then very squished on this next polygon. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to squish this in, or no, I'll pull it down in the UVs. And then this second one here, I'm going to push up so that they look a little more similar. And I could go through and do that for everything. I could do that. I probably will. So yeah, I'll go through and change the scales and stuff. Most of this stuff you won't really notice once the texture's on there, because the texture isn't going to be this resolution. These are huge pixels. When you have your actual texture on there, whether it's like, 256, 512, you'll just see your forms and your shapes conforming to the mesh. But, it's just a matter of playing around with it. So again, I see this thigh here. This thigh could go up or could go down actually. Squish down a little bit to fix that. And then the next one, I think, could go up even more. I think there's some funny stuff going on in the chest here. The head is going to look weird because I'm basically turning a circle, a sphere shape into a square. You can alleviate that by doing this sort of thing, like pulling these down to be more reminiscent of a sphere. And that'll kind of fix that, but you're connecting your mirror point isn't going to line up anymore on the grid. So you can make that consideration for yourself. For now, I'm just going to leave it like that. The neck also looks funny. So I'm going to fix the neck here. Looks a bit stretched, so I'll give it a little more space on the grid. Pull this up. Yeah, that's okay. Wait, let's just compare. Okay, so the arm, I think the arm should be bigger, just a little bit bigger overall to match up with everything. And the head, you can decide if you want the head to have more space or not, to be bigger. Usually you want to get a little more detail in the face, so you can leave that bigger. But now that I have the proportions relative to each other looking okay, I'm going to scale these back down and Tetris them, organize them in the UV space. And I like to do this by hand. I'm sure there's a button I could press that just kind of fills the UV space with these shapes in the most optimal way. But I'm going to do it by hand just because I want to have more control over it. So we're left with quite a lot of real estate on this texture. So what I might do actually is just cut the legs back off. So the legs can go there. Maybe I'll put the head on top. This is kind of the fun part of UV unwrapping, the Tetrising of everything at the end. I'm not going to scale too much because I know that our proportions were looking good before. So yeah, that's totally, dependent on what the character is going to be, what you want to do with the texture, how you feel things should look. But generally you want to keep the proportions the same unless you want something with more detail like the head, and then you can enlarge that just like I did here. And yeah, just try to use the space. I could spend more time on this just trying to fill this entire space with these UV shells. But I think you get the idea. That's kind of as far as I want to take that. I want to move on to the next part. So yeah, so we have this other half here. I'm actually going to select the faces and just physically delete that half of the mesh. And then I will duplicate and invert the mesh that's done already. And what that will do is copy our work, our UV work, onto the other side of the character, and we don't have to do the same thing twice. Duplicating stuff that way, you might have to invert the normals, which is what I did here. That's why they appear red in the UV editor. That's a Maya specific thing. You just want to make sure that when you do duplicate it, you want to make sure that your normals are facing the right way, because sometimes that can flip the normals. Anyway, so yeah, we have the character, both sides of the character, all done. And all that's left to do is combine both halves. And at least in Maya, I'll go through and I'll weld the two halves together. I'll just do that really quick while we're here. And then I think now we have a hard edge there because we just chopped it in half. I'm just going to smooth it, soften edges. So now we have a seamless mirrored character. We have all the UVs laid out, and we can move this around if we want. Just make sure that we're grabbing both shells at the same time, both left and right, and moving those. And yeah, from there you just start your texture. And as you're texturing, you might find that you'll have to move more of these UVs around, and that's totally fine. That's usually the way it goes. But yeah, that's how I do it. That's how you do like a low poly, low resolution texture unwrap and packing of the UVs and everything like that. So, but yeah, that's a organic mesh in a low poly style in a low resolution texture UV unwrap. And so now I would like to also show a different example, because this is actually quite different from how we did the last two unwraps. This is a different story. This should actually go a little quicker even, but we'll get into unwrapping this bridge here next. Unlike with the character model, where I like to UV unwrap everything and then create the texture using the UVs as a guide, for inorganic models like this bridge or like a house or something like that, I actually like to do the texturing and UVing kind of simultaneously. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll create a swatch basically of materials on the texture of like a piece of wood, the brick that I want, pieces of metal, whatever, hinges, frame, molding, stuff like that. I'll put all that onto a texture atlas. And then as I'm creating the model, or when I get, kind of done with the model, I'll go in and apply the UVs from there and make changes to the mesh as I need them. Using that process, it's kind of more like the model's finished already, the texture's finished for the most part, and I'm just taking UV projections and arranging the UVs on the atlas, the texture map, as I go. This bridge is going to be one material. It's just going to be this brick texture here, and I'll use this throughout the entire mesh. And I've actually prepared this mesh. This is a mesh from the game, so it's already been created with all these ideas in mind. So for example, I have this extra mesh here, which will be used to put one row of bricks across, like the whole thing, to create that kind of archway pattern in the bricks. Because when I apply the brick texture, for the most part, it's going to be just this straight generic brick layout. But for this part, I want it to curve around. I've also isolated this part up here because I want to do something specific with the railing and give it kind of a little top by doing some kind of UV trickery. So I'll show you how I do all that stuff right now. So let's just start with a good old UV projection. I'm going to do another UV projection on the Z-axis, and then we're going to get the entire thing in the UV editor like we're used to. And so I guess for starters, let me just get rid of the base of the bridge, put that over there for now. For starters, I'll show you what I meant when I was talking about that archway layout. Basically, I'm going to take all these and overlay them on top of each other. There's some on each side, so we'll do it all at the same time. So I'm going to scale this up, put it kind of inside this one here. I'll grab this one and put it inside as well. And then from here, I'm just going to line things up to make it easier to grab everything. So I'm going to be straightening out these edges. And from here, I'm actually going to make this into a straight line instead of an arch. And you'll see as I do that, the bricks will start to align to this curve, just like we did with the character model when we straightened out those UVs. The texture sort of aligned itself with the curvature of the mesh. So I'm going to do this, just kind of get roughly a straight line out of these, and then I'm going to square everything up just like before. I'm going to turn off this like filter so we can see through the UVs and also brighten this texture up. We can decide what row we want to use for the bricks here. So I'm going to pick a nice row here, this one right here. This corner, we're going to want it to look like a single brick. And I'm just realizing now that I actually have UVs hidden in here, so I forgot about them. So let me just grab those. It's these here. I'm going to try my best to grab them. So I have all those selected, and it turns out that there's these UV faces underneath this line that I made. So I'm going to pull those out. Hopefully that worked. Yeah, so you can see that now I have texture information on that side there. Let's use a thicker brick row here so we have some more space for the texture. So now this center here, that we can see the center line is in the middle of some bricks, and that way I get the effect of a single brick creating that corner there. And the pixels are a little big there, so I'm going to actually stretch this out and get it to where we can see a couple keystones and stuff in there and just move it around till it looks kind of cool. So let's choose a keystone. I'm going to use this more square stone here, and I'll just position it so that becomes the keystone. So now that looks like this. It's a little squiggly and stuff, and that's just because we're stretching the UVs in such a way. But at a distance, and especially if you're looking at it through some kind of filter, like a pixel filter, a dither filter or something, it's not super noticeable. We can go in here and make this a little nicer even, and give it more stones maybe, or whatever. So actually, you know, now that I'm looking at this, I kind of want to just mirror. Let's see what that looks like actually. So if I put these back across, yeah. Okay, so basically I mirrored across this edge here instead. So I collapsed these UVs on top of themselves. So the spine is right here. Let me show you here. Yeah, okay, so the spine is now on this edge here, and we're basically tiling the same brick on both sides. And now I can actually stretch this out this way, and we can get some nicer square pixels in here. Now I have more detail to use on each of those sides rather than squishing it between the two faces. So do we have a good keystone here? I don't think we do anymore. I'm going to use, let's see, I guess a little keystone. I guess that's what I imagine a keystone, like a little thing. So it's actually this stone here that I'm using as the keystone. And I think I can even get away with stretching out a little more, maybe just a tad more. I think for the game asset, I actually go in and I try to line it to the pixel itself so we don't get any half pixels. You can do that if you want. It definitely uses up a lot more time. So you can do that if you so desire. So yeah, we have this archway now being described by a nice row of bricks. Maybe I want to stretch it out even more just to get more stones. It's just a matter of playing with it until it looks nice. I think it looks okay for now. Let's take care of this big chunk back here. And for that, I actually want to remove the railing because I'm going to do something special with the railing after. So I'm going to select it. It's like the edges. I'm going to cut those edges and just remove it from the equation for now while I think about what I'm going to do with this broad side. Oh, and I guess while I'm at it, I should separate the pathway. So I'm going to separate this part here as well. So I'm going to cut these, cut UV edges. We will try and just grab the broad side and leave the pathway here. So we just got to remember this is the pathway and these two faces here, and we'll do something with those. And this is the broad side, and actually we still have the arches connected. So I want to separate those as well. They're going to be a little tough to grab because they're underneath this layer here, but a little trick is just to grab them through the UV editor because we have a nice view of them from here. And then I should only have those edges selected. So I'm going to cut those edges. Once again, just separate them. Now we can see we have these archways here. We'll get to those later. And now the broad side of the bridge, I almost just want to not touch it at all because this is a perfect orthographic projection we've done. So it's basically going to end up just like that in the final product anyway. So I'm going to scale it up until the bricks look like they're at a good detail level. So that's pretty much finished there. The railings, similar to how we did the archway thing here, I'm going to straighten out the railings as well. And that way we can use a single row or a couple rows of the stone texture in a nice, useful way. So that should work out pretty good, but there's still an issue with the top being just one pixel line there. So I think what I'm going to do is simply, oh, you know what? Okay, yeah, so I actually forgot these ends here. I think I'm going to actually attach all these things together. So that'll be just like the end of it. So I'll do that for both sides. I'm going to select them and just do a projection on the x-axis, and that'll make our cuts and everything for us because it's just projecting those things. And so at that point, we can bring that over here and scale it up to be just about the same height as our broad side, and that should mean that the bricks all line up nicely. And we can, we can touch that up and get that to line up perfectly if we spend some more time on there. And yeah, you can grab them and snap them onto each other too. That helps in some cases. I don't know what these buttons are in your software, but if you know how to use, snapping and stuff like that, that's useful for lining up edges if you don't want to weld them together necessarily. Okay, so back to the railings. Yeah, I was going to select these faces and then change my selection to a UV selection and then simply drag these down. Is that right? Is that what I should be doing? You know what I'm going to do is just unwrap it. I don't know why I decided to do it that way. Okay, so I've unwrapped it and I'll just overlap these because they're essentially the same thing. Straighten everything out just like we've been doing. And now I'm going to find a nice little row of bricks to use on this element here on the railing. I might, what I actually do is I'm going to make this side here the same exact thing as this side. So I'm not doing twice the work. So I will detach this from the top, cut the UV edges, and I'm just going to overlay this. Let's make sure that these line up. Okay, that's the bottom. All right, we're going to have to invert this. Okay, so I'm going to just overlap these with the other side. So it's just the same texture on each side. And now what I actually want to do, instead of just making it a single row of bricks, for example, just like scaling it to fit into here, I actually want this face here and consequently the opposite face to have a little extra brick on top. So let me stretch this a bit. I'll try to illustrate what I'm talking about here. I want to scale up to kind of match the broad side, the broad face. It's probably going to end up being this length anyway. So I'll try to match that here. Oh, actually, sorry. It's going to be the length of this if it's going to be the proper size. So I'm going to just do it by eye. And so that's generally the same size. And now what I'll do is I'll put on the bottom a little seam so you can actually see it gets darker here at the seam. I kind of want you to see that there's a change in the direction of the bricks. This line here kind of messes up the illusion, so I'm gonna move this whole thing down. Yeah, something like that. And so now this railing has its own kind of change in direction up here because I've laid it out this way. And for the top, this is the top here. I'm gonna bring this down and create a little lip out of the brick there. So I'm putting like maybe a third of one of the brick rows right there, and that kind of creates the illusion of a little top. So we have kind of like a little finalization that the mason did, or maybe like a little protection for the rain. I'm not sure what that's called, but yeah, just a little finishing touch there on top. And then the last thing is this top part. We don't want that showing any cracks or anything. We want that to stretch all the way across. That might look a little funny, but at least the in-between of each of the brick for this little top piece is going to be consistent across the top. So we'll see if there's like a crack on the side, like here. It follows through on the top and then around either side because it's just mirrored. We just mirrored these things. And also it looks like we get, because we put the seam right at the end here, we also get a nice benefit of having a crack right at the edge where the railing meets the pathway. So that also creates a nice little touch there just to make it feel a little more realistic. Now, pretty much done. We just have to do the path and the arches underneath. So yeah, very fast. A lot more fun, honestly. I forgot like how much more fun it is to do this sort of thing because you can really get creative. I guess I never mentioned in UV space, this square here that you usually see a square of positive and negative UV space on both the U and the V axis. That's not where it ends with UVs. You can actually just go for an infinite length outside of that space there. You can go back here or forward or up or down as far as you'd like to go. So like out here, I've stretched this thing out like crazy and it's beyond the bounds of the UV space here that we see with the texture on it. And that's because it's just going to tile across. So depending on your material in your game engine or something like that, you'll likely have this ability as well to just be able to put stuff out into this space, which I use all the time. There are import options, I know for Unity specifically, for the images that clamp, I think it's called, that clamp the bounds. So for example, this would be transparent. It would only ever display what's within this positive range here. So yeah, there's some considerations there, but with a regular material, you can put stuff out here anywhere you want, and it'll continue to be visible on the mesh. Okay, so where were we? We got caught up in talking about some other stuff. The pathway, we're just going to unwrap it. This is simple. Enlarge it. That's kind of cool, actually, to have it like the walkway be tilted like that. I might just keep that. That's cool. Why don't we just keep that? That's nice. I like that. That looks pretty good to me. If you're worried about the size of anything, you can always kind of use your other UV shells as a reference point. Like if I was doing a straight up and down for this shell here, I could easily just tilt it and line it right up with this, which I know is the same edge here, just to make sure that the size is okay. But I really like that like little tilt there. That's kind of cute. So I'll keep it like that. That looks kind of cute. So we have that, and underneath we have these 3 archways here. And these, I'm gonna just overlay them because they'll be the same. Line these up as best I can. And that middle one's a little bit bigger, so stretch it out. And I will square off all these UV edges here. I honestly couldn't tell you if a bridge has this scheme for the pathway that the structural elements also have that. I'm going to say no, though, and just keep them straight up and down. So I will tilt this to the side, and we have our bricks going all up and around and over under the archway. And I'm just going to eyeball the scale. I don't know if that's the proper scale or not. Maybe it's a little small. Let me scale down a little bit. And I did just notice an issue. Where was it? Something happened here. Yeah, okay, so this edge is not right on this one for some reason. You see how it's stretching right across? So we need to take that, and we need to just align that with its friends up there. There, okay, so that fixed that. And that was it. That's really quick. I forgot how fun it is to do this sort of thing. I really like this kind of puzzle creativity of, like, for example, this railing. We kind of added a feature to it that was never there in the model. But we gave it all the extra detail of that railing just by the way we arranged our UVs on this texture. Because you can get really creative with what you do with the texture itself. And that's why, like, I recommend, or this is what I do, my own practice, is to get the basic model down, finish your texture map, and then go in and add these little extra things. Like this was something I added afterwards to give it that extra detail on the archway. This, if I was making a perfectly optimized mesh, I would actually weld these edges to the top because there's no reason to have this polygon there. But because we have an extra polygon there, I can do this special detail with the railing. But yeah, that's that. Those are the 3 kind of main case scenarios for UV unwrapping. We went all the way from a simple cylinder, right? Just a basic asset, understanding the basics of what unwrapping is actually doing and kind of imagining how it works physically, and then laying out the UVs. And then we looked at the character model and understood that it's basically just a series of cylinders that we're unwrapping in a very similar way. We looked at how to pack the UVs for a low resolution texture. If you were dealing with a higher resolution texture or a larger poly count for the character, this technique wouldn't maybe not get you the same mileage, but for a low resolution, low poly character model, this is the technique you want to use. And yep, that helps you pack away these things nicely and makes texturing on that scale a lot easier. And then, of course, our cute little kitty corner tiled bridge, which I guess I would classify as inorganic or hard surface modeling. And yeah, you saw it. It was a very different technique to the way we did the character model, right? Let's put him up here on the bridge. So you can see how the process varies quite a bit between these 2 things. I do believe that if you found yourself in a situation where this type of unwrapping would work better for your character, or the character type of unwrapping would work better for your hard surface mesh, then go for it. Like, this is all up to you sort of stuff. These are just the main polar ends of the spectrum for unwrapping things. So you'll find use cases for both of these, for all of these, for maybe none of these in all the different types of models that you'll encounter. So if you can kind of get these down, you have a good chunk of the ground covered with what you need to know. That pretty much does it. Don't want to spend too much more time on this. It should have been a very simple, straightforward tutorial, but it actually turns out it's really difficult to actually put into words what's happening because it's such a bizarre thing that we were doing. Just like taking a 2D image and putting it on a 3D thing. I don't know. It's just, for some reason I had difficulty explaining it. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you gained something from it and you learned some things that you can use in the future. And of course, as always, you can always message me if there's anything that you weren't sure about or something that you'd like answered or clarified. You can always message me and let me know, or leave a comment or anything like that. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this, and I'll see you around. Take care.